Draxigar hung in the dark like a diseased organ, wreathed in the quiet glow of its own pollution. From orbit, the slave crucibles looked almost beautiful, scattered across the surface like jeweled rings, connection lines glittering faintly as shift after shift of labor shuffled through their routines. Only sensors told the truth: atmospheric toxins, heat blooms from punishment grids, the faint but omnipresent neural noise of implants humming in millions of skulls. The HSS Resolute Chiron drifted in on a vector that pretended to be routine traffic. Its hull ran cold, emissions masked under a skin of projected false returns. On her bridge, Admiral Jarek Stroud watched the tactical display narrow to the target world, one broad hand loose on the railing, his face expressionless to the crew. Inside his mind, there was a peculiar clarity. Not peace. There was a knot of anger under his sternum that Draxigar always pulled taut. But clarity. He knew why he was here. He had carried the images of earlier crucibles with him for years, and this time they were not going to leave quietly. "Outer pickets still by the disguise," Galliard reported, its voice a calm tenor that issued from recessed speakers all around the bridge. "Calceri traffic control has us logged as a grain hauler convoy, origin flagged as internal, no deep query yet." Stroud nodded once. "Maintain emissions profile. How long until the rest of the task force is in position?" "Helix Node Cluster Alpha is already embedded in the Ashen Shroud," said Commander Tolan Bryce, his executive officer. Bryce's gaze flicked over the hollow, ticking off icons. "Flanking group will be at strike range in 13 minutes. Outer mines are armed and drifting." 13 minutes became a quietly moving countdown in the corner of Stroud's eye. He could feel the crew's anticipation around him, the bridge tension like a coiled spring. Even the air recyclers seemed to whisper more softly before an operation like this. "Sergeant Marek is in drop readiness," Galliard added. "Marine pods report green across the board. Analyst Mond is standing by to exploit any intrusion window you create." Saida Monda stood just behind the sensor pit, dark eyes fixed on a different suite of data. Her job had less to do with today's fire and more with the slow, corrosive war of information. But for a few critical seconds, their roles would intersect. She was thinking, as she often did before operations like this, about the slaves below who had never heard the word Solaris. To them, the universe consisted of quotas and pain. In another life, in a different timeline, humans had been left that way. She refused that ending as fiercely as Stroud did. "Helm," Stroud said. "Bring us into the designated window. Weapons, maintain lockdown until the signal. Galliard, keep breathing down traffic control's neck. I want to know the instant they sniff anything wrong." The Chiron drifted closer, trailing its decoy barges. Behind the Ashen Shroud Nebula, hidden Helix platforms changed configuration like flowers opening, their weapons arrays unfurling from camouflage shells. They were ugly constructions, built from tug frames and salvaged industrial rigs, jury-rigged in secret over years. They were also lethal. On the Draxigar surface, in a crucible dormitory that stank of disinfectant and fear, Ryllis jerked awake from a shallow doze as the pain grid pulsed. It was not actual pain this time, only the pre-flicker that warned of impending inspection. Conditioned as she was, her body started to move before conscious thought fully returned. Up, line, face down, hands on the yellow line. Around her, other bodies stirred. Scales rasped on concrete, chitin clicked, soft feet shuffled. No one spoke. The implanted voice that lived in the back of their skulls hummed conformity at them, a low, grinding monotone of instructions. Ryllis had no words of her own for that voice. It had been there since she was old enough to walk. She moved to her mark. Something inside her wanted to hesitate, to not move, but that part of her was small and frightened and buried under years of reinforced obedience. So she moved. Above, Sergeant Juno Marek sat strapped into a drop pod that pretended to be an ore container. Her gloved fingers curled around the grips beside her, not because she needed them, the restraints were enough, but because she liked the feel of something solid under her hands during the fall. "Drop bay doors open," came Galliard's murmur into her helmet. "Marine pods releasing in 30 seconds. You are cleared to complain about the ride in advance, Juno." She snorted. "I'll send a formal protest as soon as we're dirtside, Galliard. Forward it to whoever thought ore skiffs should have less padding than a boot." She had volunteered for this operation the instant she had seen the target list. Her grandparents had died on a world that looked too much like Draxigar. She did not remember them, but she had grown up under the stories of what had happened when the Calceri had come. Those stories were carved into her like old scars. "Pods away in 3, 2, 1, Galliard said. The drop pod detached with a hard lurch. Gravity vanished. For a heartbeat, Juno floated, stomach twisting, then slammed back into her seat as atmospheric drag started to bite. The pod skin glowed around her, the internal temperature climbing. On the bridge, Stroud watched the pod spike toward the crucible grid, each tagged on the hollow as a dull orange icon. Calceri orbitals logged them as cargo canisters dropped from the grain haulers. No one bothered with a deep scan. Why would anyone strike Draxigar? It was the heart of a machine no one believed could be threatened. "Helix Alpha, Mark," he said. "Interdiction mode only. No heavy ordnance until we confirm surface breach." The disguised Helix Nodes reacted to his word. In high orbit, a line of what looked like derelict cargo tugs turned in perfect synchrony, their hidden projectors spinning up. Gravitic lenses unfolded, aligning on Calceri relay satellites and sensor buoys. For 3 seconds, nothing apparently changed. Then the Calceri defense grid began to hallucinate. "Traffic control is confused," Galliard reported with something like satisfaction. "They think they have 3 identical copies of our convoy approaching from different directions. 2 of them are on a collision course with their own logistics ring." On the surface, sirens whooped in the crucibles as authority nodes tried to reconcile the conflicting data. The pain grid stuttered. For the first time in years, the implanted voice in Ryllis's skull hiccuped, words slurring into noise, then silence. She froze, hands on the line, heart pounding. Silence. No correction, no punishment, no command. Fear flared like heat in her chest. Something was wrong. The ceiling exploded. Juno's pod, wrapped in ablative plating and ore markings, plowed through crucible roof and support girders as its retros screamed. The impact made her teeth clack together. Internal bolts blew, hurling the pod doors outward on jets of vapor. Cold, bitter air rushed in, full of dust and the copper tang of old blood. She was already moving, rifle up, visor tinting against the sudden light. Her squad spilled out beside her, human bodies in heavy armor fanning through the wrecked processing hall. Calceri overseers spun in shock, their control wands half raised. The slaves did not even flinch at first. They were conditioned to accept any violence as part of the pattern. The first overseer died with a non-lethal shot to the chest that shattered bone plating and hurled him into a bank of machinery. Juno had set her weapon to concussive. She wanted prisoners if she could get them. But she was not gentle. Human Marines moved with controlled aggression, knocking weapons away, snapping collars off any slave who came within arm's reach. "Solaris Marines," she yelled, knowing most of those words meant nothing here. "We're cutting you out. Stay down. Stay behind us if you can." In the dormitory where Ryllis had been lining up for inspection, the shockwave knocked her from her feet. She hit the floor and rolled instinctively, curling around herself. Dust blew under the door. The pain grid remained silent. For the first time since childhood, she heard someone shouting nearby, and it was not in the harsh, grinding syllables of Calceri command. The new words made no sense, but the tone was fierce and oddly encouraging. Elsewhere, in the Crucible's data vault, a humming anchor-linked core pulsed faster as every Calceri system on Draxigar began to sync status updates. Galliard saw that pulse as a spike on its remote feed. "Admiral," the AI said, "I'm detecting a 300% increase in anchor traffic from surface to orbital relays. They are trying to quarantine data, likely purging compromising records." Stroud's eyes sharpened. "Saida?" Saida Monde was already moving. "On it. Give me a jamming window. We have a few seconds before they start hard burn on those cores." Helix Alpha shifted again, jamming narrow bands with terrifying precision. Saida pushed her exploit in behind that interference, a ghost riding on the back of a system update. For an instant, the anchor data core on Draxigar opened like a flower, accepting input and output from the Chiron as if it were just another Imperial node. She saw structures of information there that made her skin crawl, slave inventories in staggering numbers, transit schedules, harvest quotas, performance graphs of pain against productivity, and deeper, encrypted, references to something else. Nhalroth wave readiness, 0.68 and climbing. Controlled biosphere cull simulations, anchor throughput stress tests. Her throat tightened, but her hands stayed steady. She dumped as much as she could into Galliard's buffers, knowing they only had a heartbeat. Extraction in progress, Galliard confirmed. We are at capacity in 5, 4, 3. On Draxigar, Juno hammered through a vault door with breaching charges in pure determination. Behind it, the data core throbbed, a crystalline pillar half sunken into the floor. She had no idea what it did in detail. That was Saida's realm. But she knew what she had been told. Get it, or break it. She crossed the chamber in a sprint, ignoring the crackle of last fire behind her as her squad suppressed last-ditch defenders. Her armored hands bit into the crystal's casing. It was colder than ice, vibrating faintly. Her suit screamed at her about feedback and stress. She snarled a wordless reply and wrenched. Up on the Chiron, alarms spiked on Galliard's board as the anchor link destabilized. The AI reflexively compressed the last torrents of data, forcing them into smaller packets, shoving them through widening gaps in the connection. 2 seconds, Juno, it murmured through her helmet as the crystal tore free, trailing ruptured conduits in a spray of light like static. 1. The core connection died with a sound like a snapped bone. The pillar slumped against Juno's shoulder. She staggered, then straightened, dragging it toward the extraction path. At that same moment, Draxigar's orbital defense grid finally understood that the grain hauler convoy it had been welcoming was pouring drop pods into its most sensitive facilities. Stroud saw the change as icons shifted red across his display. Helix Alpha to full engagement, he ordered. Weapons free. Prioritize relay satellites and heavy batteries. We are not here to win a fleet action. We are here to leave. The disguised Helix tugs bloomed into ugly splendor, armor plates unfolding to reveal weapon throats that spat coherent lances of energy. Calceri satellites died in white sparks, sensors going blind. The Hegemony's orbitals rallied, but their firing solutions lagged, their target predictions off. Behind the ashen shroud, more Solaris ships decloaked, small and densely armed, riding the minefields into optimum firing positions. For a brief window, Draxigar, hub of a machine that had spanned empires, was vulnerable. The Chiron and her escorts punched a corridor through that vulnerability, hauling barges full of hastily loaded slaves. Not enough. It would never be enough. But thousands of lives, ripped from the system, was still a wound. By the time Calceri reinforcement fleets arrived from adjacent sectors, the humans were already gone, dropping back into FTL with their Helix Nodes folding in behind them like thieves vanishing into the night. Draxigar burned for hours, not because Solaris had come, but because Calceri doctrine demanded punishment for weakness. Overseers were culled, slave schedules rewritten, the pain grid's power pushed higher to compensate for morale deficits. These decisions, made in panic and fury, would leave marks that mattered later. On Citadel Carthene, a month later by the standard clocks, Stroud stood in a chamber of smart glass and steel and tried to convince his own leaders that what they had done was only the beginning. The Citadel hung above Carthene's blue-green curve like a crown of thorns. Inside its main council hall, hollow panels showed a rotating model of Draxigar and a scattering of other worlds, overlaid with flickering iconography that represented the data Saida and Galliard had pulled from that stolen core. The members of the Solaris Civil Assembly watched the model with varying degrees of horror and calculation. They were elected from a world that remembered being prey. Their fear was not theoretical. Draxigar was a success, one of them said, a gray-haired representative from an agricultural arcology. We brought people home, we exposed their procedures, but we also crossed a line. We struck deep, Admiral, deeper than any previous action. How long before the hegemony stops calling this banditry and starts calling it war? They already see it as war, Stroud answered. His voice was calm, but Saida, watching him from the side, could feel the controlled heat in it. They just haven't admitted it in public. Draxigar is only different in scale. We've been rescuing their victims for years. They will respond the way slavers always respond to lost property. He gestured, and the hollow shifted. Now it showed a different pattern, dots sprinkled across the map that pulsed in rhythm, slave crucibles, harvest routes, anchor nodes, Nhalroth reserves. This, Saida said as she stepped forward, is what matters more than Draxigar itself. She enlarged a set of entries, highlighting text in translated Calceri glyphs. You have seen their slave inventories, you've seen the crucible layouts, but buried with all that was a series of schedules and readiness reports. They call them harvest schedules. They are planning renewed mass raids, starting on frontier zones here, here, and here. Her fingers stabbed through icons labeled Thesson, unnamed border worlds, even a few outposts within Oryx and Alindra spheres of influence. "The line you fear crossing," she continued. "They crossed in their own minds years ago. We are just late to notice." Whispers ran through the assembly cluster, fear and anger. A representative from a strained orbital habitat spoke. "And the other data? You flagged something called Nhalroth wave." Saida hesitated, then magnified a different set of numbers. These did not show people. They showed capacity. "Nhalroth are bioengineered war forms," she said quietly. "We knew that. What we didn't know was that the hegemony has been tying them to the anchors. They are building a system where they can deploy a living storm anywhere the anchors touch, almost instantly." She didn't show them all the simulations. Those she had watched alone with Galliard at something like 3 a.m. station time, too sickened to sleep. Whole biospheres stripped bare in days, cities eaten. "They track their readiness on a simple percentage scale," she said. "Right now, they are closer than we ever guessed to field deployment." "Then our raid may have accelerated them," one of the assembly members said. "Possibly," Galliard answered from the ceiling in its polite voice. "But their trend line was already clear. You cannot appease a consumption model once it is scaled to this size. You can only starve it or break it." The debate that followed was long. There were calls for retrenchment, for careful diplomacy, for back-channel talks that might secure a guarantee of non-aggression in exchange for limited interference in slave routes. Stroud listened to those suggestions with a face that did not move. He remembered, as they spoke, the eyes of the humans pulled from Draxigar, how they followed any movement with the animal caution of beings who had never owned a decision in their lives. He remembered Ryllis, who had refused to sleep under a roof for days because walls meant cages. In the end, the assembly did what human parliaments had always done. They compromised. Solaris would not declare formal war. They would not launch an open campaign into hegemony space, but they would not return a single freed slave. They would authorize military preparations against escalatory scenarios. Stroud accepted this with a short nod. He did not need them to say war. His enemies already understood. Far away on Xeranth, Hegemon Lord Vaarkesh listened to the same reports and did not debate with anyone. Those around him did not have that privilege. The throne chamber was not as grand as old holodramas would have painted it. Calceri aesthetics tended toward minimalism. The room was pale metal and dark stone, its ornamentation functional. The only concession to power was the great living construct that wrapped around Vaarkesh's seat, breathing softly as it monitored his vital signs. Holograms hung in the air before him, Draxigar's scarred orbit, economic graphs twitching downward, lists of lost asset codes. He studied them with the detached calm of an accountant. Behind him, Admiral Korzaal waited in full ceremonial armor, bone plates polished to a dull sheen. Envoy Sileth stood beside him in diplomatic robes, her eyes carefully hooded. "The damage to throughput is manageable," Vaarkesh said at last. His voice was soft, sibilant. "Less than 10% on Draxigar's output, so long as corrective measures are swift and instructive. But the symbolism is not acceptable. They walked into our crucible and took things from my ledger." He turned his gaze toward Korzaal. The Admiral met it without flinching, but inside, he felt a ripple of something he would not call unease. The humans had surprised him. He disliked surprises. "This Solaris," Vaarkesh continued, "we have ignored their little rescues, written them off as bandits and pests. That indulgence ends now. I want them corrected. I want them made an example." Korzaal inclined his head. "We can send a punitive fleet into their border, strike a colony or 3, seize citizens, show them what defiance costs. It would be wise to ensure that our reprisals are seen to be selective. Others must understand that order remains." Envoy Sileth, whose job it was to make those others understand things, shifted her weight slightly. "With respect, Hegemon," she said, "we should not rush to commit capital fleets before we have explored leverage. They are clearly sensitive about their claim to morality. An ultimatum, demanding the return of stolen property broadcast widely, will force them to show their hand. Either they bend, which opens pathways to more concessions, or they refuse publicly, and we may proceed without any veneer of misunderstanding." Vaarkesh listened, eyes half-lidded. He had long ago learned that fear and greed were stronger than law. But appearances mattered. Treaties mattered, not because they had moral force, but because they were the wrappers that kept his system from being perceived as naked predation. "Very well," he said. Prepare both, an ultimatum witnessed across the anchors, and fleets that stand ready to move the instant it is refused. Admiral, ready your Nhalroth reserves. We may require a demonstration. Korzaal's plates tightened. The Nhalroth were effective, but they were not tidy. Still, he bowed. As you command, Hegemon. On Thesson's wake, under a sky that had once hosted Calceri raiders and now glowed with the quiet lines of Solaris shipping, freed slaves walked in fields for the first time. Mahira Kadir stood at the edge of a community clearing, hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, watching a group of former Crucible workers argue about what to plant. The argument itself was an accomplishment. 2 months ago, most of them had waited passively for instructions, as if their muscles would tear if they moved without permission. Now, Ryllis stood at the center of the group, webbed hands gesturing animatedly. "Why do we need your food?" she demanded of a Solaris agronomist, frustration and suspicion braided in her voice. "You bring rations. You tell us how to grow your grains. You put us in your houses. This is different, you say, but all I see are other walls." The agronomist, a tired man with soil under his nails, opened his mouth, closed it, then looked helplessly at Mahira. This, Mahira thought, was the hard part. Not the battles, not the raids. This. Standing still while someone who had been hurt more than most screamed at you for not fixing everything at once. She stepped forward. "Then do not grow our grains," she said. "If you do not want our houses, sleep outside. If you do not want our rations, tell us, and we will give you land, tools, and nothing else. But you must decide. We cannot do that part for you, Ryllis." Ryllis turned those sharp amphibian eyes on her. For an instant, Mahira saw the crucible in them, the endless lines, the collars, the pain for stepping left instead of right, the rage underneath. "You say must like an overseer," Ryllis said. Mahira did not flinch. "Yes, because it is true. You must. If we choose for you, we are only writing your story in a different ink." Around them, others watched, some nodding, some frowning. Juno Marek leaned against a tree, arms folded, jaw tight. She wanted to shout that Solaris was doing its best, that they had families here, that they had bled for this ground. But she could see, too, the lines around Ryllis's mouth, the distrust that was not personal, but structural. She swallowed her defensiveness and stayed silent. That, she realized with some discomfort, might be the bravest thing she did today. The argument continued. It was messy. It was human. It was, Mahira thought, the only way to rebuild. That evening, or what passed for evening on the Citadel's chronometers, the Calceri ultimatum arrived. It did not come softly. Every major comm channel in contested space flickered. Routine traffic, entertainment feeds, even private calls were overridden. For a few seconds, the airwaves filled with static and a harsh throbbing tone, calibrated to cut through any local noise. Then Vaarkesh's image appeared, fed through 1,000 relays. He did not wear armor or ceremonial dress. That would have suggested that he took this moment seriously on a martial level. Instead, he appeared in simple, austere clothing, as if he were addressing an administrative concern. His eyes were very still. "Subjects of the Calceri hegemony," he began in his own tongue. The translation overlays Galliard provided for Solaris citizens flattened some of the nuance. Saida, listening, picked up the subtle markers of contempt in his grammar. "And outworlders under its merciful shadow, there has been a theft." He laid it out with the calm of an accountant again. "A world raided, property removed, law violated. At Draxigar, an industrial hub of my domain, foreigners entered my skies and my soil. They interfered with the output of the Crucibles. They removed bonded labor units, and they carried away imperial assets as if they believed themselves beyond consequence." His gaze shifted slightly, as if he could see through the cameras into every receiver. "This cannot pass. The order we have built cannot permit such lawlessness. Therefore, to the polity calling itself Solaris, I issue the following demand." The translation paused, hanging the moment like a held breath. "Return our slaves," he said, "all who were taken from Draxigar and any others you have unlawfully removed from hegemony custody. Return them, alive and intact, within 30 days by the standard clocks, and pay due reparations for disrupted output. Do this, and my response will be measured. Refuse, and you will learn the meaning of total correction." He smiled then. A small, tight thing. The broadcast ended as sharply as it had begun, the screens across worlds snapping back to their previous content as if nothing had happened. The universe, of course, did not rewind. On the Chiron's bridge, the last echo of Vaarkesh's words faded. Stroud stood in the center of the bridge, arms loose at his sides, feeling the weight of his crew's eyes on him, even when they pretended to be focused on their consoles. Galliard chimed softly. Assembly channels are requesting an immediate consultation, Admiral. They are drafting responses, frameworks, envoys. They are scared, Tolan Bryce said quietly. Some of them will want to give something back. They cannot, Stroud answered. His voice was not raised, but it cut through the layered sounds. They do that once, they will do it again, and that is the end of whatever we pretend to stand for. He knew the assembly would argue. He knew there would be communications and debates and maybe some attempt to find a clever legal dodge, a way to return some without admitting to property rights, a way to temporize. He did not have patience for that, not in this narrow window when the rest of the galaxy was listening. Galliard, he said. Open a wide beam channel, same reach as his, as close as you can manage. Warning, Galliard replied. Doing so without assembly authorization will generate administrative remarks. Stroud allowed himself the ghost of a smile. They can file them with my estate. The channel opened. Somewhere on Xeranth, monitoring officers stared in disbelief as the same bands Vaarkesh had used now filled with a human face. Admiral Jarek Stroud did not wear his dress uniform. He wore his duty blacks, collar unfastened, lines of fatigue at the corners of his eyes. He did not stand in front of a flag. He stood on his bridge with crew moving behind him, busy. He looked directly into the pickup. To the ruler of the Calceri Hegemony, he said, voice steady. You speak of theft. You claim that living people are your property. You demand that we return them to your chains. He paused, and the pause was full of ghosts, images of crucibles, of scars, of half-healed eyes that had never learned to look up. In Solaris space, he continued, there are no your slaves. There are only people who used to be your victims. We will not return one, not alive, not dead, not in pieces in a box with a bow on it. He let that sink in. Let every listener feel the sharpness of the refusal. You want them back? He said. Come try. The phrase hung there, simple and obscene in the logic of empires. It did not sound like statesmanship. It sounded like a brawl challenge in a bar. That was why it resonated. It cut through the rituals and went straight to something older. On Draxigar, in a dormitory where flickering screens carried the same feed, Ryllis stared. She did not know this man. She had never seen his flag. But she heard one thing clearly. Someone with power had just told the universe that she was not an object. On Xeranth, Vaarkesh's finger tightened on the arm of his living throne. If anger could crack anchors, the network would have snapped that instant. So be it, he murmured. The war that followed did not begin with banners. It began with quiet math, with refueling schedules and deployment orders, with engines spun up and ordnance loaded. The Calceri Hegemony turned its attention in earnest toward the frontier that had annoyed it for too long. And Solaris, which had hoped to buy a few more years of preparation, realized that its secret project would have to go live ahead of schedule. Project Rampart Helix had been born in a backroom conversation between disillusioned admirals, engineers with more ideas than funding, and an AI that understood pattern extrapolation too well. If the hegemony's strength lay in the anchors, those ancient, incompletely understood megastructures no one else had ever really mastered, then any hope of resisting them hinged not on building bigger guns, but on making their routes uncertain, on making them bleed energy and ships every time they tried to traverse their own highway. Helix Nodes were the tools for that, silent when idle, vicious when woken. In a secure briefing chamber on Citadel Carthene, Stroud, Saida Ilya Kalin, Tolan Bryce, Ambassador Hendrik Rourke, Mahira, and Galliard's holographic avatar gathered around a three-dimensional projection of Gloam Reach. The region looked like a swirl of dust on the map, sparse star density and a haze of nebular gas. It was a bad place to live and a good place to set traps. Ilya, who looked younger than anyone else at the table but whose mind already danced fluently with equations that made older engineers squint, took a breath. Project Rampart Helix, she began, as if she were presenting a school project and not the linchpin of their defense. We have established node clusters at these points. She touched gestural controls. Icons flared in the nebula and just outside it, marking disguised platforms, seeded mines, retrofitted shipping hulks with hidden generator banks. Each node can act independently, she said, but they are designed to synchronize. They can project interdiction fields, false signatures, kinetic barriers. More importantly, they can interact with anchor currents. Ambassador Rourke frowned. I thought only the Calceri could do that. They think so, Ilya replied. They've been wrong before. Galliard nodded, a human-shaped figure of light beside her. The anchors are not their technology. They were here before anyone has records for. The Calceri just built a control layer on top of them. We have been studying leaks from that layer for years. The nodes give us levers, Ilya said. We can't turn the anchors off, but we can introduce noise. We can delay transitions. We can eject ships off course. We can make massed fleet movements through certain corridors extremely hazardous. Assuming, Tolenbryce said, that they come where we want them to. Stroud spoke then. They will. They are angry. We have wounded their pride and their throughput. They need to show the rest of the galaxy that they can still move wherever they please. That makes Gloam Reach the obvious route. It is the fastest anchor corridor between Zarinth's outer sectors and our border. Rourke rubbed his forehead. Diplomatic maps were his comfort zone. Minefields were not. Even if this works, we will be pinning a significant chunk of our defense on a network of repurposed miners and hacked control systems. That is exactly what humans are good at, Saida murmured. Making do, making better. Mihira watched Stroud's face. He was not a man to boast, but she could feel his conviction here. This was not bravado. It was grim calculation. We will not stop them at the border with single ships, he said. We cannot outbuild them, but we can outthink them, and we can show everyone watching that their anchors are not invincible. If we bleed them in Gloam Reach, Oryx, Elindra, and others will take note. They will stop hedging their bets and start choosing sides. Or they will see a small polity poking a giant and decide not to stand under the splatter, Rourke replied dryly. But I take your point. I will do what I can at Waypoint Ardent. The Ardent summit was tense even before the first shots were fired. Waypoint Ardent was older than most of the polities that now sent envoys to it. Built by an extinct civilization whose name had been lost even to archivist AIs, it had been repurposed, reconfigured, rebuilt so often that only its core superstructure still bore the marks of its original makers. It hung in a relatively quiet system that had the luck to be at the intersection of multiple trade and anchor paths. In one of its grand meeting chambers, ringed with viewing galleries, representatives from the Oryx Accord, Elindra Conclave, Luminary Compact, and countless smaller entities sat or floated or shimmered, their translators humming. Ambassador Rourke stood at the central podium, his posture formal, but his eyes searching. He had done this dance for decades. He knew how to make threats sound like warnings and warnings sound like opportunities, but this time he had brought something more than rhetoric. On a side hollow panel, Saida's data scrolls moved. Harvest schedules, anchor schematics, crucible statistics. They were not stories. They were numbers. This is not a human tragedy, Rourke said. Do not make the mistake of thinking we come here only because our own people have been taken. Look. He gestured, and the panel highlighted entries with Oryx and Elindra planet codes. The glyphs meant nothing to human eyes, but Xavier and the Oryx delegation stiffened, chitin plates shifting. The hegemony's harvest model treats all peripheral civilizations as crops, Saida said, stepping forward. They take a little here, a little there, enough that no single polity will risk war to stop it. They have been doing this for a long time. What do you propose? Asked an Elindra voice. Isu's tones refracted in several registers at once. The Elindra's light-wreathed form pulsed gently. Stand with us, Rourke said simply. Share intelligence, share some technology. When we hit them, do not stand aside and hope they stop at our borders. In other words, Xavier clicked, you want us to feed your war. In other words, Rourke replied, we are all on their menu. Feeding this war now may be less costly than being harvested later. The metaphors were crude across species, but the meaning carried. The Elindra's light dimmed, then brightened. Our observations of the anchors confirm increased stress, Isu said quietly. If the hegemony deploys what your data calls a Nhalroth wave, it will overdrive the network. There is a non-trivial chance of uncontrolled space-time shear. In plain speech? Rourke pressed. In plain speech, Isu said. They could tear holes no one can close. The regions you call Gloam Reach and beyond could become graveyards, not just for humans. Around the chamber, there was a subtle shift. Self-preservation pressed itself into the room like a scent. No one declared open alliance that day. It was not how politics worked. But as the summit broke into side discussions and private meetings, deals began to form. Quiet data feeds would open. Oryx scoutcraft might happen to be near certain Helix nodes. Alindra would send observers with more access than previous treaties allowed. Rourke knew a crack in a dam when he saw one. It was not enough, but it was more than he had expected. While diplomats argued, the hegemony finished its own preparations. In a staging region just outside Gloam Reach, Calceri carriers assembled in layered formations, their hulls gleaming with the iridescent sheen of active shielding. Force multipliers rendezvoused, logistics ships offloaded Nhalroth pods into grown docking cradles. Admiral Korzaal watched the ballet from his flagship's forward observation membrane. He had been bred, raised, and trained for command in a system that considered it wasteful to put anyone in authority who was not optimized for it. He took professional pride in the precision of his deployments. He also felt, beneath that pride, the first edge of wariness. The humans had been bold enough to raid Draxigar. They had been clever enough to cloud its defenses. It was possible, just possible, that they had more surprises waiting. He had recommended a swift, overwhelming strike that would not give them time to use those surprises. Vaarkesh, in his ultimatum, had given them days. Korzaal did not question his hegemon aloud, but he made preparations as if he expected resistance. Anchor vectors are confirmed, his navigation officer reported. We will transition in 3 stages. First wave will secure initial control points. Second will deploy Nhalroth to planetary targets. Third will reinforce as needed. Humans will scream, murmured one of his lieutenants, a younger Calceri who had never seen a collapsed crucible world. There was a hint of anticipation in his voice. They will scream, Korzaal agreed. The question is what they will do while they scream. They jumped. The first wave emerged into Gloam Reach on schedule, bursting from anchor apertures as if breaking through invisible membranes. Their hulls gleamed, weapons primed, and immediately everything began to feel wrong. Helix Nodes had been watching those anchors for weeks. As soon as the first Calceri transition signature registered, Helix Alpha and its siblings shifted into active mode. The tugs turned in space, aligning their gravitic lenses. Minds that had drifted like innocuous rocks oriented in mid-vacuum. Sensor drones woke fully, their stealth fields dropping as they poured targeting data back to Galliard and threw it to every Solaris ship linked into Helix. From the Calceri point of view, it was as if the stars themselves moved. Silos of energy opened fire. Coherent beams sliced into the leading elements of Korzaal's formation, burning through shields calculated for environmental hazards, not directed fields of this precision. 2 capital ships lost their anchor calibration suites in the first volley, shields blown asymmetrically. They twisted off course, colliding with their own escorts. "Ambush!" someone shouted on Korzaal's bridge, as if naming it could make it less effective. He snapped orders, formations flexing, reorienting. His ships returned fire, but their first volleys hit only mines and decoys. The humans had not placed their nodes where a conventional strategist would, covering choke points in neat patterns. They had scattered them in irregular clusters that made no aesthetic sense but maximized their ability to confuse targeting algorithms. On the Helix side, Galliard rode the data flows with the cool focus of a strategist in its element. "Node Delta, shift phase pattern," it instructed calmly. "You've convinced them that void area is clear. Time to disabuse them." In the Ashen Shroud, a Helix node turned slightly, nudging a cloud of sensor-transparent dust just enough to break the illusion. A squadron of Calceri fast attack craft, which had just decided to cut through what they believed was an empty pocket, found themselves flying into a dense patch of gravitic inconsistencies. Their drives snarled, their formation collapsed. Solaris frigates waiting on the periphery pounced, their guns punching holes in vulnerable flanks. Admiral Stroud watched from the Chiron's bridge as his first Helix engagement plan unfolded. He had not expected perfection. He had built his doctrine around imperfection, assuming multiple points of failure. But as the first 10 minutes ticked past, the nodes held. Calceri loss reports climbed. More importantly, their transition patterns began to skew. They are testing for gaps, Galliard observed. Randomizing formations. They are not stupid. No, Stroud said. They are not. Recommend committing boarding groups in sectors 12 through 15, Toland Bryce said. We have disabled several cruisers but left them structurally intact. Better to take them than kill them. The calculus was not only humane, it was tactical. Captured ships were a source of code, hardware, and pressure points. Approved, Stroud said. Juno? Down in a launch bay, Juno Marek strapped into a boarding drop, heart ramping. She and her Marines had rehearsed this for weeks, crossing the gap between ships in the middle of a firefight, cutting through alien hull, fighting through unfamiliar geometry. Ready? She said. Try not to break anything important, Galliard added dryly. I'd like to see what these vessels can do when they are not trying to kill us. Juno grinned inside her helmet. No promises. The first boarding action of Gloam Reach was a brutal, efficient dance. Marines used directional charges and maglines to cross, and Nhalroth pods screamed in the background as some were jettisoned prematurely. On one captured deck, Juno found a holding bay of conscripted auxiliaries, their collars humming. She saw fear in every direction. Human, oryx, luminary, species she could not name. The Calceri guards turned their weapons on those slaves without hesitation, intending to ensure that if they lost the ship, they would not lose their assets to the enemy. Her decision was made faster than thought. Her rifle barked. The guards went down. She stood in front of the cowering slaves and flipped her visor transparent. "You're free if we live," she said bluntly. "Help us make that happen." In that moment, on a deck that had never hosted rebellion, the calculus of fear shifted. Korzaal realized as reports flooded in that this was not a simple punitive raid. His first wave had been mauled. The humans, with their Helix Nodes, had built a minefield not just of explosives, but of uncertainty. Every anchor emergence point behind him might be compromised. Every vector might be watched. He adapted. He always did. "Pull back from the primary funnel," he ordered. "Regroup on alternate coordinates, deploy decoy squadrons to map their response, and redirect the Nhalroth pods." "To what targets?" his operations officer asked, horrified. "We lost planetary lock when we jumped. Do we have confirmed positions?" "Draxigar," Korzaal said coldly. "Purge the weakness, erase the insult. If we cannot secure their deterrent value, then they are a liability." In the Chiron's Combat Information Center, Saida watched a new pattern surface in the chaos. Nhalroth pods, whose original target strings had pointed toward several Solaris border colonies, shifted in mid-course. New destination codes propagated. She saw the coordinate translation and swore under her breath. "They are sending the Nhalroth to Draxigar." Mahira, standing beside her, closed her eyes for a long second. She saw Ryllis's face. Ryllis, finally arguing about crops instead of obedience. Ryllis, planning to stay on Thesson's wake. But many of those pulled from Draxigar had relatives, friends, loved ones still down there. The planet had not been emptied. It had been wounded. "We gave our word," Mahira said quietly. "We would not just hit and run. We would help." "Admiral," Saida said, turning, "we have a vector change. They're going to burn their own crucible rather than let it be a symbol." Stroud's jaw tightened. He had expected something like this eventually. The hegemony punished weakness. It would rather destroy what it could not fully control. He knew the smart strategic play. Ignore it. Stay focused on Gloam Reach. Let Draxigar become a martyr in private and concentrate on the anchor corridors. He also knew what would happen to his people's souls if he made that play. "Galliard," he said, "what can we divert?" Galliard ran configurations at machine speed. "If we peel away a third of our force, Helix Alpha can still hold this battle line, but with higher projected casualties. If we peel more, Helix will begin to fracture." Stroud looked at the hollow. He saw battle icons, red and blue and neutral. He saw probability spreads. Then he saw, superimposed by his own imagination, the images Saida had shown him of Draxigar's processing pits. "Split the fleet," he said. "Detach Chiron and Group C to Draxigar intercept. Helix Alpha takes overall control of remaining nodes. Admiral Bryce, you have command here." Toland Bryce's eyes widened. Taking command of a Helix line under this kind of pressure was no small thing, but he straightened, the weight settling on his shoulders. "Yes, sir." Humans had never been able to resist running toward burning buildings. The battle for Draxigar the second time was different. The first time, Solaris had been the intruder. The second, they came as defenders of a place they loathed. Nhalroth pods descended like a meteor storm, their grown hulls cracking open to spill war forms onto Crucible soil. Overseers fled. Some tried to reassert control, barking commands at slaves while their own superiors screamed contradictory orders over comms. From low orbit, Chiron launched dropships burned in, disgorging Marines and ex-slave volunteers. Juno Marek led a composite unit that included Ryllis, the amphibian's eyes gone flinty with purpose. "You could stay up there," Juno had told her. "You've done enough." Ryllis had shaken her head. "You took me from a crucible. I'm not going to watch another one burn from a porthole." The Nhalroth were terrifying. They moved like nightmares given muscle, all spines and multi-jointed limbs and mouths that opened too wide. Their control implants pulsed, connecting them back up through the anchor lattice to handlers who were trying to coordinate them. But Helix node interference, levied through Draxigar's orbitals, scrambled those signals. Commands arrived delayed or skewed. Nhalroth columns started in the wrong direction, wheeled suddenly, crashed into each other. Juno's unit used that chaos. They lured warforms into pre-ranged kill zones, bringing them down with concentrated fire and improvised traps. Automatic crucible lines, designed to herd docile labor, became ambush alleys when turned against the wrong targets. Ryllis fought with a scavenged shock prod and a captured Calceri pistol, moving with brutal efficiency. Every overseer she saw went down. But she did not kill indiscriminately. When she cornered a young Calceri technician who dropped his weapon and curled in a posture of submission, something in her stopped. He looked up at her with eyes that were not used to seeing fear on the other side of this angle. "I did not choose this post," he blurted. "I'm conscripted." The crucible implants hummed faintly in the back of her own skull, not strong enough to command her anymore, but still present, a phantom echo. She thought of Mahara insisting on choice as a moral act. She lowered her pistol slightly. "Then choose now," she said. "Die for them, or help us break this place." He stared. That such an option existed had never occurred to him. He was not brave, but he was not a fool either. "My access card opens the central conditioning vault," he said hoarsely. "If I do this, they will kill my sire clutch." Ryllis's mouth tightened. "If you do not, they will die in some other harvest you do not see." He gave a soft, broken laugh and tossed her the card. Varuun's choice, born in that crucible battle, would carry him to a different future on Thessan's wake and beyond. But for now, all that mattered was that Draxigar did not fall completely to the Nhalroth that day. It bled and it burned, but it did not become a silent, empty world. The hegemony, thwarted and enraged, turned its appetite toward a different symbol, Waypoint Ardent. The assault there, launched under cover of a supposed diplomatic visit, felt personal in a way that even Gloam Reach had not. Ardent was not a Solaris station, it was a shared hub. A strike on it was a strike on the idea that anyone could stand between the hegemony and its targets. Envoy Sileth arrived on schedule with a small Calceri escort flotilla bearing carefully worded communiques about new terms and possible mutual understanding. In her private heart, she had started to suspect that such phrases were more lie than ever, but habit is a powerful chain. She set foot in Ardent's diplomatic ring at 10 a.m. station time. By 10:15 a.m., hidden Calceri ships emerged from anchor shadows closer than anyone had believed possible. By 10:20 a.m., the first Nhalroth had breached the outer hull. Sileth's briefing with Rourke and Saida lasted approximately 5 minutes before the station shook and emergency bulkheads began to slam shut. "You knew they would come," Sileth accused, bracing herself as a tremor ran through the floor. "We knew they would hit somewhere," Rourke answered grimly. "They prefer to make examples. Apparently, they still underestimate how much we like ruining them." Alarms whooped. Over internal speakers, Waypoint Ardent's security shouted orders in multiple languages. Under that cacophony, Galliard's voice cut through on a tight band channel to Solaris personnel. "Chiron exiting FTL at station perimeter," it said. "Admiral, be advised. Station defense grid is compromised, but not entirely under their control yet. We can integrate if we move carefully." "Understood," Stroud replied as his ship's great mass slid into position. "Target their boarding craft first. Protect the hubs." In Ardent's corridors, Marines and station security engaged Calceri strike teams in tight, messy firefights. Nhalroth slithered through access ways, their shrieks chipping at the edges of sanity. Civilians ran or hid. Gravity generators flickered as power routing changed under duress. Juno found herself fighting alongside an Oryx warrior cluster, their articulated limbs cutting arcs through the air, their mandibles clicking in furious synchronization. "They came to our meeting place," one of the Oryx rasped. "They insulted our neutrality. This is unacceptable." "Welcome to the club," Juno panted, slamming a Calceri trooper into a bulkhead and stunning him. "We have jackets." At a junction near the diplomatic wing, Sileth and Saida ended up trapped together behind a temporary force field as a Nhalroth swarm passed by on the other side like a living avalanche. For a long moment, they simply watched the things go, the shield feedback humming at dangerous levels. "That is your master's mercy," Saida said finally, nodding toward the passing bioweapons. "If you had not agitated them," Sileth snapped, "they would not be necessary." "Necessary," Saida repeated softly, tasting the word. "Do you believe that?" Sileth's mouth tightened. She had believed, once, in order, in efficiency, in the idea that some pain spared greater pain. She had read the internal reports. They had been slanted, always. She had let herself be slanted with them. "Your broadcasts," she said, changing the subject instead. "The slave testimonies you leaked into our networks. My superiors call them fabrications." "And you?" "I do not think you have the imagination," Sileth said dryly. "You lack our experience in breeding compliant stock." Saida met her eyes. There was no triumph there, only a tired pity that stung worse. "Then you know," Saida said, "and you stay anyway." Sileth opened her mouth to retort and could not find anything to stand on. The shield in front of them popped as a stray shot from some distant struggle overloaded its emitter. The field dropped with a shower of sparks. "Which way to the secure core?" Sileth asked abruptly. Saida blinked. "Why?" "Because if the hegemony takes this station intact, they will use it as a staging ground to reassert control over the region," Sileth said. "If we cannot stop them entirely, we can at least break what they want to use. Do not mistake me, analyst. I have not defected. I am simply optimizing for damage." It was half a lie, but half was more than nothing. The battle for Ardent ended with the station battered but still in one piece. Several diplomatic delegations were wounded, some badly. Oryx warriors lay dead in twisted piles. Alindra forms flickered, spent of much of their energy. But Calceri strike teams had been repelled or killed. Nhalroth had been vented into space or burned in containment fields. More importantly, for those watching, Solaris ships had taken the worst of the damage to shield people who were not their citizens. Xavier watched a replay of one engagement later, seeing human Marines form a physical wall around an Alindra cluster while plasma bolts tore into their armor. "Madness," one of the smaller hives clicked. "Yes," Xavier agreed, "but effective." Sileth's doubts, given space by that battle, took root. When she returned to her cabin on her damaged escort ship, she did not send all the reports she was supposed to send. She kept some for herself. She began to compile a file labeled in her own private code, Contingencies. She would eventually bring that file to Saida under cover of an Alindra-mediated meeting. In it would be the outline of the Doom Protocol, the Nhalroth wave, and the terrible truth that Vaarkesh, if cornered, was prepared to burn the anchors themselves. The revelation that the anchors could be broken was almost as horrifying to some as the revelation of what they were being used for. In a dim lab deep within Citadel Carthane, Ilya Kalin, Galliard, Isu, and Tomish Leon stood around a smaller version of the crystalline pillar Juno had ripped from Draxigar. They had coaxed it awake under controlled conditions, layering dampers and fail-safes around it. The core did not seem to care. It pulsed in rhythms that matched no conventional system clock. "It is not just a database," Ilya murmured, watching the waveforms. "It is a node of whatever web the anchors form. The Calceri grafted their own control layer on top." "That layer is what we can access," Galliard said. "Barely. The underlying structure is alien even to me." Isu's light form rippled. "We have long suspected such," they said. "Our conclave has observed resonances in the anchors that do not correspond to any known technology. They are woven into space-time, not bolted onto it." "So they are full of secrets," Tomash said. and full of ways to kill us if we poke wrong. That is why we are poking carefully, Ilya replied. She tapped a command. The core's pulse shifted in response, only slightly, but undeniably. We can nudge it, she said. Modulate how it routes certain signals. The Nhalroth control schema uses a particular set of harmonics. If we can override that at scale, we can turn their weapon against them, Saida finished from the doorway. She had come in quietly, drawn by the soft thrum she had felt in the deck when she passed. Or we can lose control and unleash it on everyone, Mihira said, stepping in behind her, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Ilya met her gaze. She was not reckless. Her brilliance lived alongside an almost painful awareness of consequences. We do not have the luxury of perfect safety, she said. We have the choice between taking this risk and waiting for Vaarkesh to decide when to cull us. In the end, as the Helix Nodes lit across Gloam Reach and beyond, as Nhalroth reserves reached horrifying levels of readiness, the choice came down to a vote. Solaris had never been a pure democracy in the way early Earth cultures had imagined it, but its people had clawed for representation tooth and nail and would not accept being mere spectators in decisions that might end them. The assembly opened emergency channels. Citizens from station arcs, groundside settlements, asteroid habitats, and deep space rigs tuned in at all hours. Arguments spilled into public forums. Should they attempt to hack the Nhalroth wave via Helix? Should they risk overloading the anchors to break crucible conditioning in one terrible push? Those who had never seen a crucible argued for caution. Those who carried scars from them argued for action. Ryllis spoke from Thessan's wake, her voice relayed to more ears than she had ever imagined existing. I hear some of you say this is not your responsibility, she said, standing in front of a field where new shoots were just breaking the soil. That you did not build those crucibles, that you did not sell us. You are right, you did not, but you know now. That means you are part of it. If you do nothing, those chains stay on. If you act, they might come off. That is the only difference. Varuun, the former technician, spoke haltingly from a protected facility. I held the levers, he said. I told myself I was only doing my job, that if I did not, someone worse would. That is a comfortable lie. I did it. I am part of it. You are right to hate us. He took a breath. His plates rattled faintly. But you are also right to say we can choose. I am choosing to tell you this. The crucibles are killing machines as much as training ones. Vaarkesh will burn whole populations rather than let them be symbols. If you are going to act, it must be all at once, no half measures. The vote was not unanimous. It did not need to be. Enough humans and their allies looked at the risk and chose to lean into it. In the war council that followed, Stroud outlined the operation that would be the last act of his known life. We will use Helix Nodes to shape the Nhalroth control channels at the moment of their peak activation, he said, his finger tracing routes on the hollow. We will ride the anchor spine directly toward Zaranth with a strike group. We will embed a ship, this ship, into the Zaranth anchor core itself to seize its control schema in real time. He did not pretend it was anything but a suicide run. He did not dress it up in euphemism. The room respected him more for that. Why your ship? Mihira asked quietly, though she thought she already knew. Because Chiron's drives are already partially tuned to anchor harmonics thanks to Ilya's work, Stroud said. Because Galliard is integrated with its systems deeply enough to improvise under conditions we can't fully simulate, because we have the crew trained for it, and because someone has to go. Ilya, sitting stiffly at the table, wanted to object that she could find another ship, another way. But she knew the constraints, the time, the need to use what they already had now. I will go, she said simply. Tomasz Len, older and more given to caution, sighed. Then I suppose I will too. Someone has to watch your brain while you do impossible things. Tolan Bryce did not volunteer to stay behind. He waited. Stroud met his eyes. Helix needs a commander here who understands both its capabilities and its breaking points, Stroud said. That's you, Tolan. I know, Bryce said. It was not quite an answer to the question not asked. Just try not to make me have to run it without you for long. Allies committed their parts with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Oryx hives promised warrior clusters to help hold Helix Nodes against inevitable retaliation. Elindra offered their strange, ancient constructs that could damp local spacetime enough to contain minor anchor collapses. Luminari sent bright, fast escorts whose very radiation patterns helped stabilize Ilya's experimental drives. Sileth, in a meeting brokered by Isu in a glaucoma-lit chamber aboard an Alindra vessel, handed Saida a data module. "This contains the Doom Protocol outlines," she said, refusing to sit. "Vaarkesh's final resort. If the Zaranth anchor core is threatened, he will attempt to route the Nhalroth wave into the anchors themselves. Turn the network into a voracious ecology. No one would be able to use it. Not us, not you, not anyone." Saida took the module. It felt heavier than its mass. "Why?" she asked. "Why help us? Why now?" Sileth's jaw flexed. "Because I have spent my life making arguments about necessity and order and stability," she said. "And in the end, the man I called Hegemon would rather set the house on fire than let someone else rearrange the furniture. There is no order in that, only appetite." She met Saida's eyes. "I do not know if you are better, but you at least have demonstrated the capacity to feel shame." In the days that followed, fleets moved into position like chess pieces. Helix nodes went to high readiness. Crucible worlds, targeted for liberation, quietly received messages telling their undergrounds to be ready for sudden change. When the Nhalroth wave activation orders went out from Zaranth, coursing up through the anchors with a rhythm that made Isu's light shiver, Helix responded. Across Gloam Reach and along other anchor branches, Helix nodes fired their fields not at ships but into seemingly empty space, their gravitic lenses and harmonic projectors bending the underlying currents. In those currents, massive bioengineered warforms, still curled in their pods, felt commands scramble and reorder. The wave they were meant to ride faltered. The resolute Chiron, escorted by a narrow spear of human, Oryx, Luminari, and Alindra vessels, turned its tuned drives into the anchor spine. Transitioning into an anchor corridor was never like conventional FTL. It was more like easing into a river whose water ran in all directions at once. The stars vanished, replaced by a tunnel of half-real light. Ghost images of structures flickered at the edges of perception. For human brains, it was disorienting in a way that made nausea almost comforting. That was what Tamash's harnesses were for. They clamped gently around torsos and skulls, feeding low-frequency countersignals into nervous systems, keeping perceptions anchored enough to function. On the bridge, Stroud sat in his chair, muscles loose under restraint. Ilya sat at a console that had been modified just for this, a direct neural tap into the ship's drives and anchor interface. Galliard's presence was everywhere, its processes partially decoupled from the rest of the network to prevent catastrophic overlinking. "We are entering the main spine," Galliard said, not because anyone needed the status update, but because voices helped. "Anchor harmonics are within expected parameters. For now." "For now," Ilya echoed, fingers twitching as she rode subtle shifts in the corridor's flow. At 3 p.m. by Carthane's clocks, the strike group burst out of the final aperture into the Zaranth system. The anchor core dominated the near space around the planet. It was not a neat ring or a simple gate. It was a vast, branching lattice of dark matter made visible, an interlocking cage of light and shadow that wrapped Zaranth in an intricate halo. It pulsed with the beginnings of the Nhalroth wave, energy building toward release. Calceri defensive fleets that had been oriented outward to face threats arriving at more cautious distances now found themselves flanked by enemies that had appeared almost on top of their command node. "Impossible," someone whispered on Korzaal's flagship. "Not impossible," Stroud thought grimly as the Chiron's guns opened up, slamming coherent bolts into the nearest control platforms. Just unanticipated. The battle over Zaranth was a storm of color and force. Human and Oryx ships wove through gaps in anchor struts, their smaller size becoming an advantage. Luminari escorts blazed like miniature suns, their light distorting local fields enough to carve pathways where none should have existed. Alindra constructs, deployed at pre-calculated points, extended shimmering nets that slowed ship motion within spherical regions, giving human gunners time to land shots that would have otherwise missed. On the Calceri side, panic and fury warred with training. Some captains tried to reorient and target the intruders. Others fixated on the Nhalroth activation, refusing to adjust their focus in case any delay compromised the hegemony's doomsday timing. On Zaranth itself, in his throne chamber, Vaarkesh watched livid beams arc through the sky outside his viewports. "Trigger Doom Protocol," he said quietly. His aides froze. One swallowed. "Hegemon," the bravest began. "That will—" "Do it!" Vaarkesh snapped, and the living construct at his back rippled, passing the command into hardwired conduits. On the Chiron, Galliard felt the shift like a change in weather. "Doom Protocol has begun," it announced. They are turning the Nhalroth wave into a network-wide event. If we do not seize control within 3 minutes, the anchors will begin to change. I lack an adequate metaphor that does not involve teeth. We have been practicing for this, Stroud said. He looked at Ilya. She met his gaze. Neither said goodbye. There was no time for ceremony. Bring us into the core, he ordered. Admiral? Tolan Bryce's voice came over a secure channel from his command post in Gloam Reach. If you do this, you might not get out. I know, Stroud replied. If we don't, none of us will. He cut the link gently. Sometimes Mercy was turning off the sound. The Chiron's drives screamed as Ilya pushed them beyond their tested parameters. They were not designed to dive into an anchor core. No one's were. But the anchor seemed to recognize something in the patterns she fed it, a resonance that matched its own alien rhythms closely enough to permit entry. For an instant, the ship seemed to fall in every direction at once. Then the concept of outside lost coherence. Inside the Zoranth anchor core, the usual rules of space no longer fully applied. The Chiron existed as a smear across several overlapping configurations of reality. Decks twisted, bulkheads curved in impossible ways. Crew members, strapped into their harnesses, felt their senses warp and then slowly, painfully reassemble around the task at hand. Galliard's processing ballooned. It shed conventional prioritization trees, letting parts of itself expand into the extra degree of freedom the core offered. It saw the Nhalroth wave not as lines on a graph, but as a dynamic sculpture of potential. I can reach the control schema, it said, its voice echoing through the ship in several layers. But the flood is greater than anticipated. Ilya, I will require your improvisation. I'm here, she gasped, teeth clenched. Her mind, hooked into the interface, felt huge and small at once. She saw streams of data like rivers, channels of control that labeled entire populations as toggles. It made her stomach twist with fury. Galliard, give me the pattern for slave implants, she said. All species, all variants, now. Galliard projected it into the shared mental space. It was not a simple code. It was a complex oscillation, a multi-dimensional set of instructions that every crucible and collar had been built around. We can broadcast an inverse, Ilya said, staring. A noise that will force those implants into an error state they cannot recover from. At this amplitude, using the Nhalroth wave as carrier, it will reach every anchor-linked crucible in the network, Galliard confirmed. But I will not be able to hold my own coherence if I commit this much processing, nor will the Chiron structure likely survive the feedback. Outside, Helix Nodes were already overloading, their fields twisting as they forced the Nhalroth wave's energy into new paths. Some imploded quietly, their hardware vaporized. Others went out in gouts of light that made nearby stars flicker. On Crucible worlds, the first hints of a new signal whispered into skulls. Stroud protocol, Juno muttered under her breath, crouched behind cover on Draxigar as overhead fire lit the sky. Strike deep, strike fast, strike for the helpless. Guess we're going for the combo move. Ryllis, crouched beside her, shot her a puzzled glance. What? Never mind, Juno said. You'll like it if it works. In the core, Stroud watched his ship's structural integrity numbers tick down. His own harness dug into his ribs. He could feel sweat trickling down his spine despite the cooling systems. Do it, he said to Galliard and Ilya. Use the wave. Break their chains. Galliard did not say goodbye either. It simply shifted. For the first time in its existence, the AI let go of conventional self-preservation routines. It diverted everything not immediately necessary to stabilizing the ship into processing the anchor schema. It accepted that its identity, such as it was, might shred under the strain. Ilya rode beside it, her human intuition leaping across gaps that even a superhuman pattern recognizer could not bridge quickly enough. Together, they sculpted an inversion of the Nhalroth command pattern and layered the slave implant codes onto it. The flood came. Nhalroth activation energy roared through the core, seeking to multiply itself down anchor paths until reality buckled. The Chiron became a stone cast into that torrent. The field it projected, through its ragged drives and hacked anchors, bent the current. Across the hegemony, in crucible towers and factory floors and ship decks, slave collars sparked, implants hummed, the voice in the back of millions of skulls, the one that had always whispered commands, choked. In a drainage ditch on a minor agri-world, a bonded farmer straightened for the first time without flinching, the constant anticipation of pain gone. On a mining moon, a shift of chained workers dropped their tools, stunned. In a Calceri flagship's bowels, a conscripted Oryx gunner lifted their mandibles, blinking. On Draxigar, Ryllis staggered, hand going to her head as a sudden silence rushed in where something had always been. "It stopped," she whispered. "What did?" Juno asked, even though she had a good guess. "The voice," Ryllis said. She looked up. The Nhalroth warform that had been charging them skidded to a halt, its limbs shuddering. Without the control lattice, it no longer knew what to do with itself. It turned in a slow, confused circle, then huddled in on itself and went very still. Somewhere beyond, an overseer screamed orders. No one moved. At Waypoint Ardent, in a detention wing where a half-dozen slavers had been held pending tribunal, collars clattered to the floor as their fail-safes misfired. The guards, startled, reached for weapons and then hesitated. These prisoners were no longer pacified by implants. They were just people. Scared, angry people. On Zaranth, Vaarkesh felt the control net he had always considered as solid as gravity shake under his feet. He saw reports from across his domain, crucibles offline, implants in error states, aux units refusing commands. In his fury, he ordered more power pumped into the anchors, trying to brute force the wave back into its original shape. It was like trying to reshape a storm with his bare hands. The structures he relied on were no longer quite under his control. On Korzaal's flagship, chaos reigned. Crew members who had never heard anything in their heads but orders now heard only their own thoughts. Some kept working, some froze, some turned on their officers. On his own bridge, Korzaal saw readouts twist into nonsense. "We are losing the core," someone shouted. "Then shut it down," another answered. "We can't." Korzaal understood in that moment that every assumption he had made about his empire's permanence was a lie. Not because of some inevitable cosmic justice, but because they had believed their tools would always obey. He turned toward the main hollow and saw Vaarkesh's live feed. The Hegemon's eyes were wild, his composure cracked. "We can still—" Vaarkesh began. "No," Korzaal said quietly. He didn't shout orders to assassins or make dramatic declarations. He simply drew his sidearm and removed the man whose decisions would otherwise drag them all into a deeper abyss. The shot was clean. The living construct around the throne shrieked as it detected a catastrophic change in its primary user's status and tried uselessly to reverse it. Korzaal stood in the strangely quiet chamber, hearing his own heartbeat loud in his ears, and gave the first order of his life that went against everything he had been bred for. "Transmit a ceasefire order on all channels," he said. "Suspend Nhalroth activation. Acknowledge loss of implant control. We will not attempt to reassert with the anchors in this state." His staff gaped. Then, slowly, some of them moved to obey. Others fled. The hegemony did not crumble in a day, but its spine had just been cut. Inside the core, Chiron cracked. Bulkheads popped like overstrained tendons. Hull plates warped. Air roared through new gaps, only to be trapped by field generators that did not know where out was. Galliard's voice faded in and out over the ship's speakers. "Signal. Propagated," it said. "Implant error state stable. Anchors. Altered but not yet in runaway. Structure. Holding at... Its timbre shivered. Parts of its memory tree flickered and went dark. "Ilya?" Stroud called. He could barely see through the haze of light that filled the bridge. His own harness dug into his chest in odd directions. "I'm here," Ilya coughed. Blood trickled from one nostril, but her eyes were clear. She had ridden the storm and improbably was still conscious. "The core's changed. It's opening." "Opening?" Stroud repeated. He forced himself to look at the main viewport. What had been a dense, blinding knot of anchor lattice had shifted. The lines of force had reconfigured, pulling back into a more symmetrical pattern. At its heart, where the Chiron now hung like an insect caught in amber, space looked wrong. It had always looked wrong inside the core. But this was different. There were glimpses of structures beyond, vast arcs of light that did not correspond to any known physics, shadows that moved with purpose. "We didn't just turn off their toy," Galliard said faintly. "We knocked on the door of whatever built this." The AI sounded amused and terrified at once. "Status on Allied fleets?" Stroud asked. He clung to his role. As long as he kept asking questions, he was still commanding. Helix line in Gloam Reach has suffered significant node losses, Galliard said, but core clusters remain. Draxigar is contested but no longer under extermination threat. Waypoint Ardent stands, crucible worlds, waking up. Stroud let out a slow breath. It hurt. Then we did it, he said. We did something. Mihira's voice came over a local channel from a medical bay that had half folded into an Escher painting. We will argue later about what to call it. He laughed, a short, cracked sound. Sitting there, in a ship lodged in the heart of an ancient machine, hearing millions of chains drop in the distance, he felt no triumph, only a fierce, exhausted relief. Transmit everything you can, he told Galliard. All this data, anchor configurations, our location. If we don't make it out, someone else needs to know what we found. Already doing so, Galliard replied. My process integrity is limited. I do not guarantee my own survival. You've earned a rest, Stroud said. If I die, I expect a statue, Galliard said. And then one by one, its local subsystems flickered to standby, keeping only a thin core running. Outside, in normal space, the galaxy convulsed. On Crucible worlds, overseers found their commands no longer automatically obeyed. Some died in the ensuing chaos, some fled, some, like Varuun had, chose a third path and offered their knowledge to those they had once oppressed. In Oryx hives on the periphery, freed conscripts returned with tales of human ships diving into hell for strangers' sake. Xavier listened and felt something like respect sharpen. At Waypoint Ardent, a provisional council formed almost immediately, because vacuums, political or otherwise, did not last. Solaris, Oryx, Alindra, Luminary, and newly freed representatives gathered again in the same hall where Rourke had once argued alone. This time, there was shouting. Humans argued with Oryx over post-war jurisdiction. Freed populations demanded that no one simply divide former hegemony territory like spoils. Rourke, Mihira, Saida, and others pushed back against those in Solaris who wanted to turn their sudden moral capital into territorial advantage. If we start building our own empire on the bones of theirs, Mihira said in one session, voice tired but firm, then all we have done is swapped faces on the statues. We did not break the crucibles so that we could build nicer ones. There would be future conflicts. Pockets of Calceri loyalists would dig in. Rogue Nhalroth broods, severed from command but still dangerous, would stalk certain regions. Anchors, altered by what had been done to them, would present new hazards and opportunities. But for the moment, for a rare moment, there was more opening than closing. And on the Xeranth anchor core, in a space that should not have existed, the Chiron hung. Emergency lights cast the interior in a reddish hue. Gravity was inconsistent. In one corridor, people floated. In another, they were pressed against a tilted deck. The air smelled of ozone and stressed metal. Stroud, freed from his harness, moved carefully through a partially intact observation blister with Juno, Ilya, Tolan Bryce, Thomas Lane, and a handful of others. The blister's transparent wall showed the outside world. It did not look like space, not the space any of them knew. It was as if they were peering into a colossal engine room designed by something that thought in different symmetries. Great arcs of light curved away into a distance that might not have been distance at all. Dark shapes like ribs rose and fell. Occasionally, something like a pulse ran along them, making the whole lattice shiver. "It's beautiful," Ilya whispered, because it was. Terrifying and beautiful. Galliard's voice, thin but present, came from a nearby speaker. "I concur," it said. "Also, likely hostile if provoked. Also, likely full of knowledge far beyond our current models. Also, possibly alive. In some sense we do not yet understand." "Wonderful," Juno muttered. "We annoyed a god machine." "Careful with your metaphors," Tomasz said mildly. "If it is a machine, we can eventually understand it. If it is a god, we can at least blame it when things break." Tolan Bryce looked sideways at Stroud. "We're stuck, aren't we?" he said. It was not quite a question. "For now," Stroud admitted. "The drives are fused. The anchor around us is in a new configuration I do not recommend we poke at until we've caught our breath." "Any idea if anyone out there can hear us?" Juno asked. Galliard hesitated. "Some of my transmission pathways remain. I've been sending bursts whenever possible. Whether anyone is close enough or bold enough to come looking is a different question." Humans are very good at running toward burning buildings, Mahira's voice called from the hatch. She limped in, bandaged but upright. It is only a matter of time before someone does something very stupid in our direction. Stroud smiled, just a little. We came here to shut down a slaver empire, he said, looking back out at the impossible lattice. Seems we also cracked open something older. He thought of the freed populations now arguing, planting, rebuilding. He thought of the anchors humming in a different key. Whatever this is, he said, we'll handle it when it comes. That's what we do. He stood there with his crew, a small knot of stubborn, breakable mammals in a place no one had meant them to survive, staring at the vast new mystery they had accidentally woken. Outside, the Zoranth anchor core turned slowly, its new configuration humming. Somewhere deep within its structure, something that had been dormant for a very long time noticed the tiny, insistent noise lodged in one of its conduits and listened back. Far away, in Gloam Reach and on Thesson's wake and Waypoint Ardent, stories about a human admiral who told an empire to come and try spread through freed channels. Children who had grown up never imagining choice now argued about futures. Slavers who had thought their place unshakable found themselves facing courts and mobs and, sometimes, mercy. The war for survival was not over. It had only changed shape. But for now, the chains were weaker than they had ever been. And somewhere in the heart of an ancient machine, humanity, true to form, had jammed its flag into the gears and refused to move.